A lot of people are talking today about the multipolar world. But what is that? At its basic level, multipolar world means there are more than two superpowers in the world. A unipolar world is one where there's one dominant superpower. A unipolar world might have been the United States after 1991, and a bipolar world was the world during the Cold War in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s. And a multipolar world is one where there are three or more major powers or superpowers. But how many superpowers are there in the world today? Well, that is a harder question to answer than it might first seem. And it's one where a little bit of history can help us see the world more clearly. But it's also an important question to answer. It defines how the international system works. It defines how all the key players relate to each other and the kind of objectives, whether it's coexistence or world domination, that they are likely to pursue. One is lonely at the top and a constant struggle to stay at the top. If there's two powers, it's company, but it's also an easily defined enemy. Three is a crowd. Four, well, that's quite a party. So how many superpowers are there in the world today? The Chief of the General Staff of the United States military, General Mark Milley, recently answered this question. He said there were three superpowers: America, China and Russia. His opinion is quite a break from standard American thinking that generally asserts the dominance of America as the leader of the free world, the undisputed leader of the world, the leader of the rules-based international order. I'm going to answer this question a little bit differently from Mark Milley, and quite differently also from many other commentators on geopolitics. I'm going to give an answer that the number of superpowers in the world today is either 5 or 0. I will come back to what the answer would be for 5 later in the video, but why would I say 0? Well, to explain that, we need to look at this term, superpower, and how it is closely linked to the stories, the histories of the rise and fall of various great powers, superpowers around the world, and similarly the story of how the world became a unipolar world, a bipolar world, or indeed a multipolar world, because there is a little history embedded in all of those terms. The term superpower emerges during World War II to describe the major partners in the alliance to defeat Germany, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States of America. So it was originally conceived as these three superpowers, the big three of the Yalta Conference: Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin. Before World War II, people did what Britain did and called superpowers empires, or great powers, as in the 5 great powers of the 19th century concert of Europe: Britain, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the German states, including Prussia. After World War II, British power collapses, first due to the impact of the war, the loss of India in 1947, and its loss of prestige after the Suez Canal crisis, and more broadly, decolonisation. But remember, there is also this place called Europe, that the war was actually fought over, and after World War II it is in ruins, but it still has a lot of potential, and a number of major states emerge from those ashes, not least the East and West Germany and of course, France. But the loss of status of the British Empire after World War II really eliminates it from the superpower equation. And although it claimed to have a special relationship with the United States and an important role in world diplomacy, there were, from the late 1940s, generally perceived to be two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And they, of course, were locked in a battle called the Cold War that lasted until 1989. They were the two major economic systems, economic powerhouses, and they were the two major military powers, both with the capacity through nuclear weapons to destroy the world in a single decision. And they, of course, fought multiple proxy wars during this period where the world was generally seen as being in a bipolar world status. Again, one has to remind oneself that there were places that did not quite fit that model. For example, there was China, the most populous nation in the world throughout this period of the Cold War. And although ideologically aligned with the Soviet Union to some degree, it was also a rival, and the United States exploited that rivalry. It wasn't really in the West's case. And there was also, of course, what was used to be called the Third World or developing nations, led to some degree by India, the large number of nations known as non-aligned nations who did not seek to ally with any of the two major powers. Again, perhaps even then there was more than two poles in this bipolar world. Then in 1989, the Soviet Union dissolves the Warsaw Pact, its military alliance of all the various Eastern European states like Poland and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. And it makes overtures for a different kind of system of international relations, not one divided into two major blocks, but one that was even, I think, then called a multipolar world in a famous address by Mikhail Gorbachev at the United Nations, exploring the opportunities for peace after this decades-long Cold War. But 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and America proudly proclaimed that it had knocked off the one single rival superpower in the world, the Soviet Union. It was now in a unipolar world. A new term for superpower was even invented. America was described as a hyperpower, so dominant across all dimensions of all other countries that it alone bestrode the world like a colossus. America, it seemed, in most American accounts, was reigning supreme. This was the end of history. There was one world system, one world power, one global culture. It did not really happen that way. There was certainly an enormous amount of military power, military spending, cultural dominance, and economic dominance for America. But there were other sources and other poles of power in the world. The European Union as a whole in the early 1990s was actually a larger economic unit than the United States, and it was asserting itself more in the world. Japan was challenging America in economic dominance, causing incredible anxiety and a host of borderline racist films from Hollywood about the challenge of Japan. And in this era too, Paul Kennedy wrote his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, in which he talked about Japan, the European Union, then still Soviet Union, and the United States, and the prospective decline or difficulty for the United States to maintain what he described as full spectrum dominance across all dimensions, across all regions of the world. By the early to mid-2000s, Europe was increasingly asserting itself, and its leaders were among the major advocates of a multipolar world, including former French President Nicolas Sarkozy. China's growth became more spectacular, especially after entering the World Trade Organization. And over the last 10 to 15 years, the dream that China would become like America has gradually dissolved. Tension between China and America, or the United States of America, has increased dramatically as China seems to move more confidently towards the status of the largest economy in the world. Then famously in 2008, Vladimir Putin gave a powerful speech at the Munich Security Conference where he pronounced the need to move to a multipolar world to challenge this idea that America set all the rules for the world, that it was a unipolar world, that there was one leader of the free world. And of course, at the same time, America had also committed enormous amounts of might and prestige and money to asserting power over Central and Western Asia in the New World Order wars and the global war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and so on. America was defending its dominance, and in a way there was a resurgence of that desire for America to be number one again with the election in 2016 of Donald Trump. And it was a dominance focused more and more against the clearly second major power in the world, China. People talked about Chimerica. People started to talk about the possible re-emergence of a new Cold War, a new bipolar world divided between blocs led by China and led by the United States. And so we get to today where even more powers seem to be emerging in the world. People keep talking about the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and other states around the world exerting influence. How many superpowers do we have today? This is where I'm going to suggest that we actually ditch the term superpower and reimagine the world as a more complex place conceived with many poles and many kinds of world relationships, world orders. Superpower is a term with a long history, as we've described, going back to World War II. It was a term invented for a very particular situation, the defeat by the temporary allies of the British Empire, the United States, and the Soviet Union of the threats from Germany and Japan, the main continental European power and the main East Asian power of those times. But is it really still an appropriate word for today? Is the word hyperpower still appropriate for today? Clearly, hyperpower is no longer a description that suits the contemporary world. America simply cannot assert its will over other countries and have it done. And even perhaps the question of superpower may be exaggerating the extent to which one or two countries alone assert complete dominance and autonomy in the world. Is there an alternative term? So in East Asian traditions of statecraft and history and thought about I guess, geopolitics, there is this term called great state, or that can be translated as great state. It means something similar to superpower, and it means something similar to empire, but without that baggage. All the various dynasties and imperial dynasties of China were known by this term, and other major Eurasian powers, including the Mongol Empire, used a variant of this term as well. In a simple sense, a great state is one that exercises dominance over other states in the world. And so I find that great state is a term that potentially can relieve us some of the baggage of a term like empire, while still serving some of the meaning of that term, and express a similar idea to the term superpower, but without the, again, I guess, a unique Cold War heritage of that term as well. It is perhaps a term that's more suited for a greater level of parity between states in the world, parity in terms of their power, influence, and impact on other nations. If we use that term from now on for the term superpower, how would we determine it? There's no objective test for which country is a great state and which is not. There's no objective test really for which country is a superpower and which is not. I guess it's a question of judgment. But on the whole, most people do distinguish 5 critical factors of power and influence, where a great state or a superpower ranks at the top or near the top of these factors in the world. And those factors are economic resources, people, territory, military power, and soft power, which is a combination, I guess, of both cultural influence, think Hollywood, think Netflix, but also think world religions, etc., and diplomatic influence. There are various ranking tools out there for these factors overall and perceptions of power and influence over the world, but I think on the whole that these 5 factors can be used flexibly to identify the top tier of states in the world. There are 193 nations in the United Nations General Assembly. There are 193 countries in the world. So how many of those are in the very top tier of power and influence in the world to justify the use of the term great state or superpower? I say 5. And those 5 are the United States of America, China, Russia, India, and the European Union. Now, the European Union is the odd one out in that list because it is not a nation state. It is a federation of nation states. It's a kind of a supranational identity. But hear me out, I'm including it amongst the list of superpowers or great states. And briefly, the reasons I identify these 5 states as great states are: for the United States, it is the dominant financial and media, soft power, cultural power in the world. It has the largest economy in GDP terms, the world's largest military spending, and it has military bases across the world in many nations, as well as being gifted with significant natural resources that are including, of course, energy resources, which are critical to military, industrial, and economic power. China is the largest economy in the world by PPP, or purchasing power parity terms. It is the second largest military spender in the world, and has enormous, again, cultural soft power. It is what some people call a civilization state with an extraordinary history and a large diaspora around the world. Russia is the world's largest territory in the world. It is gifted with enormous natural resources, borders on the Arctic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and out into the Atlantic through the Baltic Sea. And it is arguably the world's most capable military power. It has more nuclear weapons than any others, and it continues to assert extraordinary cultural power within the Russian world, as well as diplomatic power through its various alliances and partnerships with China, India, and African states. The fourth superpower, or great state as I prefer to term, is India, and it is now the world's most populous nation. It's in the top 3 of military spenders around the world. It also is a nuclear state, and it has large and growing soft power in culture, Hinduism, Buddhism, the home of many traditions and cultures and religions around the world. The traditional leader of the non-aligned nations of the global south, an increasingly assertive and skillful player in world diplomacy. And then finally, the European Union, although it is declining as a relative share of the world's economy, it is still a large share of the world's economy, a large population group as a whole, larger than the United States. It's all its combined nations are major defense spenders and include nuclear power. France, and clearly has enormous cultural power through the European traditions, the Western tradition, which is largely the tradition of Western Europe as exported through America. I'm going to go into detail about why and how each of these great states function as great states in today's world in future videos on this playlist. But I just want to reinforce that thinking in this way about the world helps us stop seeing the world as a 1v1 matchup, as a superhero movie where Captain America always wins. It's not a chessboard. There are more players than black and white. There are more pieces than 16 on each side. It's not even wholly defined, the world order, that is, by what these great states do. There are 189 other nations that play on this planet. Some of them are middle powers with great strategic assets and great strategic resources. Some are minor powers. Some even describe some of these states as the world's as vassal states for the superpowers. And I'll explore that whole topic in another video shortly as well. And then there are also other forms of power distributed around the world, multinational corporations and the international organizations, including clearly the United Nations, but other international organizations such as the G7, such as NATO, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the African Union, the various Gulf State cooperative arrangements, and the Union of Latin American States. In truth, the idea of the unipolar world was always a bit of an illusion. An understandable illusion. In 1991, it was an extraordinary moment. After World War II, it was an extraordinary moment. But some of the diversity of the world was perhaps lost in some of the triumph for America of those moments. Today, the mists created by that triumph are clearing to some degree, and we can actually see the reality of the diverse world much more clearly. As the Indian External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, says, the multipolar world is the natural order of the world. It is the factual, historical reality of widely distributed power and influence across this enormous, diverse planet. I hope this video has helped you see that diversity and has helped you think and imagine the world a little bit differently with a little bit of history. Do check out my playlist on this theme and like, share and subscribe to my channel so that you can imagine the world differently with a little bit of history. Thanks for watching.